All right, so today we're going to be talking about system and equipment malfunctions. All right, so the completion standards on the ground are going to be that the student can explain the proper procedure for handling the following types of failures: suspected carb ice for rough running engines or in partial power loss, fuel exhaustion, low oil pressure, or in total power loss, smokes and fires, and electrical system failures, and also door opening in flight, trim or flap malfunctions. During flight, the student can perform the appropriate steps for each type of system failure in flight by correctly identifying the problem, following the appropriate emergency checklist or troubleshooting steps, and communicating with ATC as needed. Okay, so it's important to remember that you are the pilot in command. You need to be decisive, you need to make quick decisions, and you need to be prepared to make those decisions. So you can use the decide model. First thing you want to do is you want to detect the problem and determine what actions are necessary. So if you see smoke, you immediately think, oh, there's a fire. If you see smoke, always think fire. Then you want to estimate the significance of the action. So this is with risk management. You want to decide how big of a problem this is and how how quickly you need to act. And then choose a desired outcome. Are we landing the plane immediately? Are we trying to fix the problem? Do we have time to troubleshoot? Identify actions needed in order to achieve this chosen option. A lot of times this can be going to the checklist, which we're going to look at later in this lesson. And then do the necessary action to achieve the change. So this is executing the emergency procedure and evaluate the effects of this action. So after you do the emergency procedure, decide if you are okay to keep flying, if it's fixed, or if you should land as soon as possible or as soon as practical. And then always remember, aviate, navigate, and communicate. So the number one thing you need to do is you need to fly the plane, maintain control of the plane, and then navigate, make sure you're going the right direction, and then focus on communicating. Your first instinct should not be to tell ATC. You need to fly the plane first and then talk to ATC. And then make sure to use all available resources. Talk to ATC, ask for assistance. If you are having issues, it's okay to ask, especially in an emergency situation. And then make sure you follow the checklists. All right, so first we're going to talk smoke and fire. So on the ground, if it's during engine start, you're going to follow the fire during start checklist. So we're going to look at that now. So this is a copy of the Piper Archer electronic checklist. You should have this on your iPad in the planes at all times. And here in the emergency procedure section, you can actually just click on the emergency procedure that you need to do. So if you have engine fire during start, it'll take you right to this. And these red boxes are what you should have memorized. So prior to going solo, you should be able to read these off from memory. You should be able to chair fly and practice it so that you have muscle memory and you can do them right off the bat once you've identified this issue. So if you have an engine fire during start, you're going to continue cranking the start switch. So the button on the Archers, it's a button, but some planes it's a key. It's going to feel wrong, but you want to continue cranking it. And while you're cranking it, you want to reach for the red lever, the mixture, and you want to pull it all the way back to idle. And you want to have the throttle all the way forward, all the way open, the fuel pump off, and the fuel selector off. And this should hopefully stop the fire. If not, evacuate the plane. You may have to use a fire extinguisher if at all possible. And then if you have a fire during flight, so this is a dire emergency, you want to land immediately, but we also have a checklist for a fire during flight right here. Again, you should have this procedure completely memorized. So when you have an engine fire during flight, it's important to cut off the source. So a good way to remember it is all sources of fuel is what you're gonna be cutting first. So first thing you're gonna do is fuel selector to off. It's gonna be in that bottom left. You just switch it. There's an right, left, and off position. You're gonna switch it to off. And then immediately after, you wanna close the throttle all the way to idle, mixture all the way to idle, fuel pump off, and then you're also gonna wanna turn off the heater and defroster. And then if this does not cut off the fire, then you're gonna wanna try to blow it out with your airspeed. So you're gonna start an emergency descent. And that is another maneuver that we will learn while getting your license is pretty much you will just pitch for pitch down and start a turn and do an emergency descent. If this doesn't blow out the final, you want to land as soon as possible. All right. So it's also, so that was for an engine fire, is what I just explained, but you can also have an electrical fire. And for an electrical fire, you're going to, instead of turning off all the fuel sources, you're going to want to turn off all of the electrical sources. So electrical fire during flight, again, you should have this red box completely memorized. Just as you would think, the first thing you're gonna do is turn, so first you're gonna turn the emergency battery switch on so that you at least have some power, then turn the battery master switch off, and then the alternator off. After this, you're gonna go to the checklist, so these you don't have memorized. You're gonna open the vents, turn off the heater, and extinguish the fire with the fire extinguisher if needed. And then if the fire persists, you're gonna land as soon as possible. Even if you put out the fire, you should still land as soon as practical. All right, so if you are having engine issues, if it's running rough or you have partial power loss, at this point, you should aviate, navigate, communicate. So make sure you're flying the plane, but then you should start heading back to an airport as soon as you notice this, because you should prepare as if an engine failure is imminent. But then you can start troubleshooting. A couple things that it could be is it could be carb ice. So in carbureted engines, we don't have this in the Piper Archer, but in carbureted engine, there is a Venturi effect of the carburetor that creates low temperatures because the air has to go faster through that Venturi because of Bernoulli's principle. And when the outside temperatures are, they can be warm. This does not have to be in icing conditions. Carb ice can build up, and this will cause engine roughness because not as much of the fuel air mixture can get through that venturi. So if you do notice some rough running of the engine, one thing you can do is turn on the carb heat. This will put exhaust heat from the engine into this venturi and melt the carb ice. A way to tell if it's working is the engine will start running a little bit rougher initially, but then it should start running better. So if you turn on the carb heat and the engine starts running rough right off the bat, don't freak out and take the carb heat off. That's supposed to happen. Another reason is this can be fuel starvation. As fuel tank runs dry, the engine may run rough momentarily before failure. The fast action is to switch tanks or apply the fuel boost pump that may avoid power loss. Yeah, you definitely want to make sure that you're switching your fuel tanks every 30 minutes. In the Piper Archers, we have the G1000 that gives us a annunciator to switch the tanks, but it can be a good idea to set a timer, or if you don't trust yourself, to remember to switch the tanks. And you just also want to be keeping an eye on your fuel consumption. Whenever you're doing cross country, make sure you have at the very least half an hour reserved during the day and 45 at night, because that is the law. But I would personally at least have an hour of reserve. Okay, and it also could be a magneto failure. a failing magneto is a common cause of rough engine running. The magnetos can be cycled in flight to determine if one has failed. Okay. Internal engine failure, so a stuck valve, etc. Internal damage to the engine may cause partial power loss. The total engine failure may be imminent. So this we can't really control so much. This is kind of our last assumption after we've troubleshooted the other possibilities. At this point, we are just trying to land as soon as possible. Okay, so the engine overheating. Some overheating may be a result in flight by, for example, increasing airspeed. That's also how we put out the fire. But overheating is a dangerous condition that should be monitored closely. So it could be the CHD and airspeed. Flying at high power settings and low airspeeds can lead to excessively high cylinder head temperatures. Avoid prolonged climbs at VX or VY, particularly on hot days. So make sure to give your engine a break every once in a while. Low oil pressure. Low oil pressure causes decreased lubrication and increased friction that can lead to overheating. You definitely want to keep an eye on your oil pressure and temperature at all times. Rising oil temperature is a sign of imminent engine failure. All right, now we're going to talk about low oil pressure. Low oil pressure can lead to a catastrophic failure of an engine and should always be considered an emergency. Just like in your car, if you run out of oil, your car dies. The same thing in a plane. So if you have a low oil level, low oil level can cause low oil pressure by starving the oil pump. And then, yes, it is an imminent engine failure. Low oil pressure will decrease lubrication and usually an indication that the total engine failure is imminent. So if you see that you have low oil pressure, you should land as soon as possible. I'm gonna reference this. All right, so total engine failure. So one thing that this could be from is fuel starvation is one of the most common causes of engine failure. Be especially cautious when switching tanks and verify that the fuel selector is fully in position. So yes, as you can see, this one's not quite in position, so it might not have fully switched. Also keep note of carburetor ice. If the carburetor is totally built up, that can be a huge problem. You can have a total engine failure. And total engine failure can also be caused by failure of internal components. So that would not be good. If you do have a total engine failure, I think we are actually going to talk about this later. Perhaps it's not in here, but I'm going to talk about it. So, if you do have a complete engine failure, if you're on takeoff, you should state this in your pre-flight briefing before each flight. You'll say when you get on the runway, if you have an engine failure, you'll apply brakes and just stop and get off the runway. If you are on the runway and you take off and you have an engine failure and you have sufficient runway to touch back down, then you'll just touch back down, brakes, land, get off the runway. If you don't have enough runway and you're below 1,000 feet, that's when you're going to do an emergency landing. And if you're above 1,000 feet, you can try to circle back and land on that same runway. So that's something that you'll say before each flight. And then another thing that you'll say in your briefing is if you have any emergencies, decide who is going to be taking controls and who is going to be taking over the comms. Because if you have two people in your cockpit, this is only if you have two people that you would do this. If you have two people in the cockpit, you can utilize your crew resource management and have one person aviating and one person navigating and communicating. I have personally experienced um, an alternator failure, which we're about to talk about next. And I took over the controls while my instructor took over the comms. So she talked to ATC while I ran the checklist and flew the plane. All right, so we're actually going to talk about emergency landing after we talk about alternator failures. So alternator failures. Alternators can fail in flight for a variety of reasons. In my case, the alternator belt actually broke, which we could feel in the plane, and immediately our alternate amps went to 0. All planes are equipped with two-sided master switch, where cycling the alternator side of the switch can reset the circuit breaker for the alternator. So cycling the switch may temporarily fix the alternator, but you should assume that it will fail again. So we're gonna go to the Purdue checklist. So if you go back up to here, right here you have alternator failure. All right, so none of these are memory items. It's a pretty uncommon occurrence. And one thing to remember is if you do have an alternator failure after doing this checklist and shedding all non-essential load, you have 30 minutes or less of power, of electrical power remaining. So it is important to start navigating towards the nearest airport as soon as you identify an alternator failure. So yes, verify failure by checking the alternate amps. Ours were at 0. Turn the alternator switch off, and then alternator circuit breaker row 1 column 3 reset, and then reset this circuit breaker as well, and then turn the alternator switch back on. So at this point, you're trying to restart the alternator. If the alternator has still failed, turn the alternator switch back off and acknowledge that you have 30 minutes. Remember to aviate, navigate, communicate. Make sure you're navigating to an airport that you can get to within 30 minutes. And then start shedding electrical load. So the non-essential circuit breakers, you're going to pull those, and the lighting bus circuit breakers, you're also going to pull that. Keep in mind that if it is nighttime, you might not have airplane lights such as landing lights or radios, which are necessary to control pilot controlled lighting and not non-powered airports. So carrying a portable VHF transceiver may be useful as a backup when making night flights. Another thing to consider is that if you do lose communications, it's important to know your light-gun signals. Or if you have a picture that you can easily pull up, that is also okay. But it'd be a good idea to memorize these. There's not that many of them. You're gonna more be focused on the air side. So steady green light means cleared to land. Flashing green light means return for landing. Steady red means give way to another aircraft. Flashing red means airport unsafe, do not land. And alternating red and green means exercise extreme caution. All right, so, and then to ensure 30 minutes of battery life, you want to make sure the battery discharge is at negative 13 amps maximum. The pitot heat is 14 minutes usage maximum. Comm radio, which you want to save for landing, 3 minutes usage maximum. And fuel pump, 2 minutes usage maximum. And then you're going to land as soon as possible. All right, if you have an instrument failure, so if your pitot-static system fails, you want to know what's going to work and what's not going to work. So the failure of a static system is most commonly caused by blockages, usually in the form of ice or liquid that can collect on the pitot tube and static ports. If a pitot tube blockage is suspected, apply pitot heat. If the static port blockage is suspected, switch to an alternate static source, which is located, we check this on every pre-flight, it's right underneath the controls. It's a little switch, and so you'll just turn that. But then it's important to know what will be affected and what won't be affected if different things are blocked. It could be a little difficult to know what is blocked, but hopefully by using your pitot heat, you can figure that out. If the pitot source is blocked, your indicated airspeed will increase with altitude gain and decrease with altitude loss. Your altitude will be unaffected and your vertical speed will be unaffected. If both static sources are blocked, your indicated airspeed decreases with altitude gain and increases with altitude loss. The altitude does not change with altitude gain or loss of altitude, and the vertical speed does not change with actual variations in vertical speed. So pretty much your instruments will be all wonky, and if this happens, it's a good idea to cover your attitude indicator or your directional gyros to prevent distractions, because you don't want to be looking at them when they are not correct. All right, if you're having hydraulic issues, if your brakes fail, you want to use full aerodynamic braking to partially compensate for this. So you want to apply full back pressure so that the wind will help you brake. And then just try to maneuver into a safe area until the plane can be stopped. The landing gear, follow emergency extension procedures and the appropriate checklist. The Piper Archer does not have a landing gear, but if you're flying the Arrow or the Seminole, that will have an emergency procedure and to put the landing gear down. If it's unsuccessful, prepare to touch down at the lowest possible speed, ideally at a towered airport where emergency services will be available. You can landings are made successfully without the landing gear, but if at all possible, you want to make sure that you can put the landing gear down with there should be a hand pump. All right, so if there's a door or window open during flight, this can look really scary when you're in the plane. This happened to me once. It wasn't a door, but it was the oil cap door I saw was flapping in the wind, and it can be a little scary to see that. But this is normally a non-emergency. Remember to fly the plane first. A lot of times it won't just flap open, and it'll actually get shut to an almost closed position. But just land the plane. Don't do any emergency procedures. Fly a normal pattern if you notice it on takeoff, and then just land and shut the plane down, get out, close the door, and you can continue. All right, if you have inoperative or runaway trim, this can be extremely dangerous and it requires prompt action. So you want to declare that it's broken. So can help to verbally say that. And runaway trim only occurs with electric trim, so be familiar with the location of the electrical trim circuit breaker and be prepared to use it. So if there's a circuit breaker, go ahead and pull it. If issues with trim are suspected, just stop using trim. Most airplanes can be landed very safely, even when trimmed incorrectly. Okay, if you have flap malfunctions. The most dangerous is the asymmetric flap extension. This would cause an uncontrollable roll to one side. If this happens, reverse the flap setting immediately. Flapless landings are simple and should be practiced often. You might just have a slightly faster final approach and you might float a little longer, but it should be able to be done safely. Pressurization and oxygen system malfunctions. So if you are at an altitude where you have to use the pressurization or oxygen system, and that starts to malfunction, starts descending immediately. You want to descend below 12,500 as soon as possible, because that is the altitude that you need to start using oxygen. You can look at this chart to kind of get an idea of how much useful constant consciousness you have once the oxygen system malfunctions. We won't be going anywhere near these altitudes, but for future reference, it exponentially increases as you increase in altitude. I mean, your useful time of consciousness exponentially decreases as you increase in altitude. So at 20,000 feet, you have 30 minutes. So you're doing okay. But then at 22,000 feet, you only have 5 to 10 minutes. And once you double that at 45,000 feet, you have 9 to 15 seconds. So that's really not a lot of time to troubleshoot. All right, so yes, to recap, the most important thing is to refer to this checklist. If you have any abnormal procedures or emergency procedures, make sure you have everything in these red boxes completely memorized before going solo. And just remember, aviate, navigate, communicate. Okay.